reactionary politics are irrational, correct? Like, I have demonstrated that for like 5 years now. I hope we're on board with this consistently. If you look at the root of like sexism or racism or whatever, there's not like some logicked out argument, you know? Usually there's a very strong emotional belief that then supplements arguments that are used to post hoc justify it. Like, people will have this deep fear. So, for example, everyone is like this, by the way, okay? The ability to construct a rational argument that is rational from the start is very tough, and it takes a lot of thought, you know? Like, that's not something most people do, and everyone is subject to emotional bias, right? So a good example of this would be insecurity. All humans feel insecure irrationally at some point. It's a social compensatory mechanism. So at some point in your life, I'm talking to you specifically, viewer, you, not the other people in chat, I'm talking to you. At some point in your life, you got in your mind the idea that someone you liked didn't like you. You didn't really have a rational reason to believe this. You just got a kind of collection of feelings from them that made you feel self-conscious about any perceived imbalance in interest. And as a consequence of that feeling that you arrived at, not a logical conclusion, but a feeling, you started treating them differently. Either you got clingy, or maybe you distanced yourself from them because you wanted to avoid getting hurt, or you felt like you were bothering them by continuing to express interest in spending time with them, so you kind of retreated a little bit. These behaviors, depending on the exact way you did them and the circumstances, these behaviors were irrational. And I bet you that you created a lot of post hoc justifications to explain why you did those things. You had an initial feeling, and after that feeling, that strong feeling that guides your behavior, you think, as humans often do, they rationalize. You think, well, it's not just a feeling. What about this? Or what about that? But the things that you're pointing to as examples of why it's rational to behave the way you do, those are things that would apply to other people too. The what about this you bring up, well, that applies to other friends you have. The what about that you brought up, well, there's nothing wrong with that. You're post hoc rationalizing. You're doing this from the feeling first, you know? Fascism is an emotional bias, fundamentally. There's a lot of stuff that ties into it, and there are many ways it can manifest and take shape. Usually, I think you can imagine the socio-political landscape as having grooves cut into it. So if you have a set of positions, you slide downhill a little bit. And the more positions that are like that position that you hold, and the more strongly you hold them, the more you get pulled into pre-existing grooves cut into, into the landscape of this environment. This is one of the reasons why conspiracy theorists usually gravitate towards anti-Semitism. There are innumerable conspiracy theories, but the more of them you believe and the more strongly you believe them, the more necessary it becomes to believe that there's some kind of single entity or group of people controlling things behind the scenes. And the more you believe that, the more likely you are to stick on to other beliefs in that line, and eventually, just through historical inertia, just because there are already so many belief systems that incorporate this conspiracy, you arrive at anti-Semitism. It's like the event horizon of conspiracy theories. It's like the point of no return. You know, it's the final tipping point. It's the edge of the waterfall. With fascism, the primary underlying feeling is one, I believe, of entitlement and insecurity. Fascism is typically a male phenomena. That doesn't mean that women can't be ideologically fascist. It just means that the predominant force in these movements tends to be male anxiety, and that's replicated pretty consistently in places where fascist movements happen. You know, that's a pretty consistent trend. Now, why? Well, I think the reason for it is because women historically have been subjected to very different expectations and standards to men, you know? Women, I think, have gotten the worst end of the stick when it comes to a lot of historical stuff, but that doesn't necessarily mean there aren't ways in which men have had a harder time. Mostly, I think, with certain expectations concerning being a breadwinner, you know, being the center of the family, being strong, being independent, warfare. You know, there are things. It's not a perfectly equal playing field when it comes to like who's suffering more or in which directions, right? I think that the way the relationship between men and women has changed has been very painful to a lot of guys who, through a variety of social and cultural mechanisms, have strong feelings of entitlement to a very specific idea of what it means to be a modern man, you know? The brown shirts back in the Weimar Republic, the ones who supported the Nazis, they felt a lot of things. They felt embitterment and humiliation that the poor economy prevented them from providing adequate livings for their families. A lot of young people felt like their futures had been taken away from them. But it wasn't just that. There was also a sense of wounded ethnic and national pride, the idea that Germany had lost World War I because they were betrayed by the inside, by Jews. That was a widely held belief back then. Anti-Semitism wasn't unique back in like 1920s, 1930s Europe. It was pretty much everywhere. It was the industrial extermination of Jews that was the wacky new addition to that particular formula. So because a lot of it had to do with like national pride and entitlement and betrayal, you had a lot of social upper crust, judges and lawyers and politicians, people who otherwise had quite a bit of money, even with the economic troubles the country was going through. They also, they went along with the fascist line, right? And then if you take a look at the messaging that the Nazis pushed when they started really gaining popularity, what did they talk about? No, like really, I'm asking, what did they talk about? If you go back and look or read historical records or whatever else, they were obsessed with the traditional family. A lot of this was because they had this like prescriptive belief that humans are supposed to have a very specific family structure, that anything which deviates from it is degeneracy, that they will literally kill you for. And under Nazis, a return to that old order could be expected. Now, the old order that they were describing didn't exist. The modern nuclear family, as we understand it, goes back in the United States to the 1950s. The idea of like individual atomized families, not multi-generational households, can be a little bit older than that. I'm sure in Germany it goes back farther than that. But fundamentally, though, it's a pretty modern idea. And that's the dialectic in fascism, the contradiction. It's a relationship between kitsch, I'm paraphrasing Alice Caldwell Kelly here, who hates me, but I like her. Kitsch, conservatism, traditionalism, an appeal to things long past, and an obsession with futurism, modernism, That's why you have fascists who will say, you have Adolf Hitler, a man who will simultaneously dress up in like Bavarian lederhosen and take drip photos of him in high-waisted shorts, and a feathered hat staring lovingly at the camera. You have the Nazi government, which promoted like German fairy tales as a way of guiding traditional morality, really old-fashioned stuff like that. But you also had an obsession with blood and steel, right? Literally like the Luftwaffe and Blitzkrieg and like new modernization, new machines of war, new ways of inventing society, build everything up. That's the contradiction, okay? But I think that contradiction is a politicized expression of male insecurity. Think about it. Doesn't that almost perfectly encapsulate the mind of the insecure, kind of like uncertain of their masculinity guy, right? This simultaneous contradictory appeal both to this like blood, iron, and lightning futurism, steely, determined, cold, iron, efficient, a machine man, the kind of thing that Andrew Tate wants you to be, right? The kind of thing he pushes for, but also this kitsch, traditional, not modern, frolic in the fields, raise a giant family in the countryside, that kind of thing. You can't have both. There's a pull in both directions. The fascist wants men to believe that they will be both a father to 9 children out in the countryside and some like man of iron who works in a steely and emotionless fashion to bring wealth and prosperity to their nation. Do you see what I'm talking about here? Fascism is that insecurity. It's just projected onto an entire political system. Now, obviously, there's variance here, and different nations, different cultures, different peoples will have different pre-existing conceptions of what that dynamic looks like. But I will say, guys, you can go online. You can test this theory by going online. Take a look at what American, Brazilian, German, Russian, Chinese, and South African fascists talk like. They talk the same. Because ironically, despite being hyper-nationalistic, fascism is an internationalist ideology because it stems from a human commonality, broken brains. And our brains are all more or less the same, you know? You all understand, don't you?